Dear God, thank you for the blessings of the Sabbath. Thank you for the opportunity to meet together to discuss concepts that you would have us learn and grow in. I pray and ask that the Holy Spirit may be with us as we discuss, study, and seek to understand what it is you're trying to achieve here on earth before you take us to your heavenly kingdom. I pray that you may be with each and every one of us personally and collectively in this study. And I ask that you may be with me as well as I try to relay the thoughts that I have, and as well as be edified by the contributions made. I pray thanking you for the opportunity. I bless your name. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. The light behind me is not ideal, but oh well. Happy Sabbath, everyone. I pray that you had a blessed week, and whatever challenges that you face throughout the week, you're able to set aside for even but a brief moment as we spend some time together. So my study, when I had started putting together this study, it was based on a book that I've been reading for the last couple of weeks. I found it particularly interesting for me as a man. The book is called entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. And as I was putting it together, there were some concepts that the author brought out, which I hadn't considered, which I found particularly interesting. But while I was reading it, some other things came to mind, particularly regarding democracy. And so I've been trying to answer the question for myself, at least, what it is that links democracy to what we are saying the Sunday law is going to be in our history. Why do the two clash heads, if you want to call it that? Why does democracy fall at the time when women's rights are taken away? It's a phenomena that you see across the world through every democracy that falls, through every undemocratic country. And the more democratic you get as a society, typically, the more rights are afforded to people, whether it be on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, or gender in our case, as we are seeking to understand today. And so my reading this book tailed off into trying to answer this question and see how histories in the past that we've been discussing, particularly those three histories that deal with slavery, the Sunday law in 1888, and again today, how those two are interlinked. So discrimination and democracy. And so as we approach the Sunday law, if you mind, let me share my screen. So as we approach the Sunday law, we recognize that we're in the formalization of the message on the line of the 144,000. But in that formalization, we also point back to the whole increase of knowledge that we've had regarding the time of the end and everything that we're in. And what we see at the time of the end in the USSR is the king of the South being confronted with democracy and democratic principles, where as a communist nation, Debbie went through styles of government in a couple weeks ago, where she laid out different types of governments and different ways in which rulers operate. And one of them is a communist regime. And so the USSR is faced with confronting this communist regime when the United States, as the king of the North, plays a part in that story, an already established democracy. But if you think back, we see the same thing happen with the king of the North this time in 1798. I mean, in 1798, where, as Ellen White describes it, a new kingdom is rising up out of the earth. And we have the United States establishing itself or raising itself as this new power, this democratic nation that's coming out of the Dark Ages. It was a phenomena that the world wasn't quite used to, having been ruled by a monarchy, by kings, seldomly ruled by queens. And so this was a new thing for them. And the same thing is happening in France at the time, whom was a player as part of the story of the King of the South in that history. In fact, it played both roles, really, through the Dark Ages and then flipping to being the King of the South. And France is going through the same story of becoming a democratic nation, or challenging the concepts of the type of government that they're in. And so later on in the study, we're going to look at these three histories that I spoke about just a bit earlier: the history of 1850, 1888, and today, and how these three lines of discrimination share similar concepts in how they relate to democracy falling and what's being challenged in those democratic principles, as well as the discrimination that people are facing in society. Why do they run so parallel? I guess that's my question that I'm seeking to answer. And why do we care so much? So just taking a step back for a moment, going back to that chiasm that we lay out when thinking about restoration, the three sins that have led to these three histories: 1888, 1850, if you want to call it that, and I'll put 1989 for today. As we're familiar with, we have Eve, Cain, and Ham, categorized by discrimination on the basis of sex, religious intolerance or religion, false worship, however you want to call it, and with Ham, slavery. We recognize that these are prophetic curses in nature, where God is foretelling what certain groups are going to face. I won't say as a result of their sins, if you want to call them that, but at least it's God saying this is what's going to happen. And so in each of these cases, I asked the question, what do these three parties and what they represent have in common? Eve, Cain, and Ham. I'll open that question up before I give my perspective. What do they have in common that sees their, for lack of a better term, progeny, their lineage, or what they represent, being discriminated against in the future?
Is it, can you say abuse or?
Okay, so they face abuse, yeah.
Inequality.
Okay, so there's inequality.
Yeah.
And the thought that came to my mind, yeah, sure. the thought that came to my mind is, and without putting it in such strong language, I won't say it so directly with regards to Eve, but we'll say that each of these three parties are an offender, if you want to call it that. And so it's interesting. So Cain we recognize, has this false sense of worship, or false idea of worship, and Cain kills his brother Abel. Ham, commits the sins that Ham commits, and Canaan's lineage is prophesied to being subjugated to slavery. And the story with Eve goes with the story of Eve. And so men have propagated that story to warrant the patriarchy. And so for each of these three systems, you have, I don't want to say Eve done wrong, and so this happens, but people justify perpetuating the discrimination because of the acts done, right? And so if we think of 1888, with Cain, with the Protestants in America and the religious intolerance, we know that that was directed towards the Catholic Church, yes, or Catholicism, because they viewed them amongst many others as a threat to who they are. So you have Catholics, after Protestants have fled to America, you have Catholics immigrating into America. And so what is the fear that Protestants have in America? Why do they want to pass a Sunday law? Question to the floor. When we looked at the Sunday law in 1888, and we read through that article many months ago about the group threat, what is it in Protestant America's mind that's being threatened, that is under threat? Anyone? Okay, well, I'll offer my hypothesis.
Religion's under threat. I guess the Protestant religion, but also their white supremacy, male domination, that they're afraid that other people will take over, because it wasn't just Catholics, it was Jews and other immigrants.
So they have a system of government that they put in place, and remember that these Protestants have fled from Europe, have fled from persecution under the Catholic Church, where they were the subjugated. And so now they come to America, they form their government, and they become those in power. They become on top of this hierarchy, if you want to call it that. And you have all these immigrants that, they become the dominant party. And so you have all these immigrants coming to America, the Catholic Church, Jews, amongst all the others, free thinkers, and they feel, okay, our sense of dominance, our status of power is now being threatened, because if we have all these immigrants coming with their ideas and we then become the minority, and if we are the minority, we cannot be those in power. We cannot hold the power in society. And if you can't hold the power in society, you can't influence what society looks like. You can't influence what the society views on the basis of gender, or on the basis of race, or on the basis of what should be the majority religion. And so when we consider traditional family values, it's in their minds that whatever family values that they hold dear, whatever values that they think society should operate on, is now going to be threatened, because these parties are going to take away our power. So that's the case in 88. So what they end up doing is discriminating, finding a means to discriminate against said other religions, putting in something that will enforce this hierarchy that they've created, or that they want to maintain, should I say, this religious hierarchy. And so what underpins that is a threat, that a fear that their power is going to be taken away. Going to 1850, with slavery, you have power in the few, in the slaveholders' hands, and should slaves be free, should Black people be given rights, there's a fear that they will become the majority and that they will enslave us. And so they seek to maintain that power, in essence. And then again, we see the same crisis happening today with gender. Traditional family values under attack. And if we are to give you power, if you want to call it that, then you're going to take away what we hold dear. You're going to be a threat to us and our way of thinking about how society should be run. Anyway, so when we think about governments and this idea of being threatened, I ask the question, what is the purpose of a government? Why do governments exist?
To make laws.
Okay, so governments, and why do they have those laws? So a government
So there's
exists.
order.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
also
laws,
to a certain extent, sorry, to take away your freedom.
yeah. Take
It's-
away unwarranted freedom. But why do they do all these things? So don't just think about your democratic government. Think about whatever style of government that exists, your authoritarian government, your monarchy, whatever it is the case. They
want to control you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a sense of control, whether good or bad, but that's ideally, well, not ideally, that's in essence what it's about of having a government. It's to be able to run a society. And so as soon as you get a group of people coming together with different ways of thinking about things, there needs to be order. And so in order to create that order or maintain that order, you need some sort of government, some sort of laws, as you said, Siri, some sort of some freedoms taken away from people to create that order. And so in essence, it's to organize society. That's what a government exists to do, is to find the best way in their minds to which society can operate. So going back to our story of and protect people from external threats. So to protect the people from external threats, to protect the people from internal threats, and to organize society. I don't know who AC's Digital is, but yeah, in essence, that's it. So going back to our story of 1798, you have this new style of government that's arising, that's not yet quite seen before. Debbie had went through how, a couple of weeks ago, went through how different philosophies of government had spurred many moons ago, in the times of the Roman society. You have the Roman Republic, all these different types of government being tried and tested, sometimes failing. But then you have the Dark Ages, where it's pretty established, that this is the order of things. There's a king and subjects and the papacy, in collaboration with said kings, with said monarchy. And so it's revolutionary when in 1798, the USA comes up. So I'm going to put a quote in the chat, and we're all very much familiar with this, but it's just a quick reminder of what purpose the United States played in this new democratic nation. So if I could get a volunteer to read GC 441.1. Oh, it's not letting me paste for some reason. Okay.
Too
I
long.
can't. No, yeah, okay, right. You're right. Let me do that. Okay, that's the first bit. So if I could get a volunteer to read that first bit. Samoy, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, what were you saying, Curtis?
Could you please read that first bit of that I sent into the chat of Grey Controversy 441.1.
41. Okay, this is what time. Give me a second, let me just zoom this up. And he had 2 horns like a lamb. The lamb-like horns indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. As the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. Their views found in the Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay, thank you. So before reading the second bit, there's 2 things that Ellen White brings up in there. Again, concepts that we are pretty much familiar with, but that this new government is established on two principles: religious and civil liberty. And we would identify these 2 foundations as the 2 horns that make up this lamb-like beast. We don't call them, we don't typically identify them as civil and religious liberty, but instead we give them the names republicanism, and Protestantism. And so this is the atmosphere that America is in right now in the 1800s, running away from royal oppression, from monarchy, and needing to establish something. So there's 2 things that they're running away from: monarchy and priestly intolerance. And so to contrast these 2 things that they're running away from, the foundations that America is built upon and that Ellen White identifies is this republicanism and Protestantism. Okay, so if we can keep that in mind as we go on to the next paragraph. Magda, if you're there, could you read that second paragraph in the chat?
Sure. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. The oppressed and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with an interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the earth.
Thank you. So this is just them describing again what we read in that first paragraph, that they're running away from something and wanting to set up something new, specifically running away from the papacy. And so we ask the question, what was the papacy's views with regards to style of government? What was its views with regards to how society should be operated? What type of government should they have? And how did they view this new democratic uprising in France as well as in America? And so when we think about that, in the lead up to 1798, through those dark ages, we can look back at how the papacy was generally opposed to democracy and popular sovereignty as a whole. And it viewed these concepts as a threat to its own authority, number one, so it felt that its authority was being challenged by these new democratic nations, or at least this philosophy of democracy and its legitimacy. So as soon as you have something, a philosophy about government, the papacy looks at it and says, hold on, if that's going to be the staple trend that we see, then how is that going to affect us? Because we have this claim to authority. We have this entitlement to authority based upon their beliefs of what the papal church stands for. And if we tend toward a democratic system of government, then that's going to take away our entitlement, our claim to this authority. And so during the 18th century, around there, the papacy came under mounting pressure from, free thinkers, from Enlightenment thinkers, from the modern wave that was passing through the world, which championed these values of reason and individual rights and popular sovereignty. And they were really a challenge to the traditional authority, as I said, of the Catholic Church. And so through the Dark Ages, the papacy becomes more and more conservative and resistant to change, specifically with Pope Pius VI, if I'm not mistaken, from 1775 to 1798, who during the French Revolution was a vocal opponent of it. He condemned, their ideas of popular sovereignty and individual rights, and vocalized that this was a threat to social order, to how society is running, and that if these ideas of having a democratic government were to come in, society would crumble, it wouldn't function. And he was concerned about the spread of secularism that would accompany this, because if you don't have an overarching figure that is telling you what is right and what is wrong, then the world is just going to become this immoral breadbasket, and traditional values are going to erode. So in essence, leading up to 1798, the papacy was skeptical of democracy and the themes that were being brought up across the world. So they have this sense of entitlement to this hierarchical structure that they've, I won't say put in place, but that they've maintained for these 1260 years. That existed before, but we'll just say that they've played an active role in for these 1260 years. And so I want to ask someone to give me the definition of entitlement, because that's going to tie into how we view all these other systems of hierarchy and their challenge to democracy. Entitlement. Does anyone have a working definition of what
Yes.
it means for someone to be entitled? Yeah.
So what I'm getting here, it says it's a legal or moral claim to a particular benefit or privilege.
Yeah. So it's the as you've just said it, the perception that you as an individual have in a privileged position are owed something, are warranted something that someone else has or that society can give you. And sometimes those things to which you are entitled are warranted. We are each entitled to food and drink. And then sometimes, which most of the time when you have these hierarchical structures, that entitlement is drawn from a false sense of belief of authority, that people owe you rank, if you want to call it that. So in the book, going back to the book that I was reading, it lays out different ways and different spheres of life where men feel that they are entitled to goods that women can provide in their minds and should provide to them. So whether that be on the basis of admiration, and so you see this in incel groups where, if you don't know, I'm sure you all do know, but just for a reminder's sake, incel groups are involuntary celibate, with the belief that because of women becoming more dependent, or women's views, they don't want them as men, and so they are involuntary, can't have sex with women. And so that sense of those attacks that come from incel groups is born from this belief that they are entitled, these men are entitled to the admiration of women, are entitled to sex from women. And so once that is taken away, it becomes a problem for them. And the book goes through different areas of life where men feel that they're entitled to something that women should give them: sex, consent, domestic labor, that they are entitled to knowledge in society, whether that be in universities or in conversation, having the final say in conversation and power. And so that was just a sidetrack. But in the sense of entitlement, it comes through the belief in a structure, and you at the top of the structure feel that to maintain this structure warrants you certain things. If someone other than Samoy, thank you for that definition, could give me a definition of hierarchy, the structure that I'm trying to describe. What is a hierarchy? Okay, I'll give you the definition that I have, at least, which you'll find on the internet. So a hierarchy is essentially a system in which members of an organization or society are ranked according to relative status or authority. So it's a pecking order, if you want to call it that, based on their status, claimed or warranted authority. And so we can ask the question, okay, so then what do we do with hierarchies? Are hierarchies wrong? Are hierarchies okay? And I would make the argument now that what is it that hierarchy that you are seeking to maintain, what is it based on? What are the basis of that? What is the basis of that hierarchy? When Debbie went through her presentation on styles of government, there was autocracies, oligarchies, there was monarchies. And so if we were to think of the hierarchy in a monarchy, that claim to being royalty came through birth, specifically came through passed down through the first male of a family. And so is that something that is warranted? A contrast to that we can think of is a meritocracy. And so a meritocracy is a government or a system where power is held by people according to merit. So where you have this ascribed status in the monarchy, there are systems which are based off of you do something, you know, you get to lead, as opposed to you are given leadership based on your intrinsic qualities. And so where would patriarchy fall into this? Patriarchy, when we are dealing with what it is we're dealing with today, is a hierarchy that falls under an ascribed status. How does that differ to your meritocracies? So an ascribed status is just a term that's used in social science, essentially, that refers to the social status of an individual that's assigned at birth or is assumed involuntarily, regardless of what they do later in life. And that position isn't earned by anyone or chosen for them. Instead, that ascribed status is assigned based on social, cultural expectations or norms and standards. And these positions are occupied by that individual, regardless of whatever effort they put into getting into that hierarchy, into that social ranking. And they remain fixed throughout a person's life because they are inherent to that person. And so if we were to think of different hierarchies that fulfill this criteria, we can think of hierarchies on the basis of sex, like the patriarchy that we've just described here, race, age, yeah, I'll leave those three, and there's many more that we can think of. In essence, where regardless of what you do, you deserve to be higher up in this pecking order because you have a certain quality, because you're a man, because you are white, because you belong to a certain ethnic group, or because you are older. So regardless of whether you do good or you do bad, you are higher than the person that doesn't fulfill those criterias that you meet, being a man, being older in society, being white, being of, as I said, a certain ethnic group. If I ask the question now, just thinking about patriarchy and questioning this idea of age, and we think back at the system in Israel where a birthright is given and honor is placed upon offspring. Who is that honor placed upon, really? It's placed upon males, but who exactly? Is it any male in a family that's given that birthright? Think of the story of Jacob and Esau.
Firstborn.
It's the firstborn. And why? Sidri? Why couldn't Jacob get that birthright?
I think because they considered the most important. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's what I think. because they're firstborn and they got lots more status, and especially a male. So yeah, they would have the inheritance of whatever's being passed down.
Okay. Yeah. So in that story, there's something that you mentioned, which is that one has a status regardless of what they've done. These are two newborns, if you want to call it that. They're both young at the time when this is being decided. So they've not really done anything to earn that birthright. It's just something that's ascribed to them at birth. So it's a quality, as we were describing in ascribed status, that it's a quality that's given to them. They've already been placed on this pecking order, no matter what they've done and no matter what experience that they've had in this earth. And so the same thing we can see in patriarchy. Two siblings come out the womb, a male and a female, and one is already placed on top of the other in this pecking order. Race in society, I won't say out the womb because, but two children, same age, one is placed on top of this patriarchy because of their nationality or because of their race. And so it's the same problem that you see in each of these circumstances. If you want to think of the patriarchy, race, age, class, yes, exactly, class. It's the same problem and the same sin, if you want to call it that, that infects each and every facet of these lives. It's something that someone feels that they are entitled to because of nothing that they've done, because of something that's intrinsic to them. And so this falls into another concept called social dominance theory. And so it's essentially, again, just these social hierarchies and how these hierarchies are maintained and perpetuated through society. Thinking back at Lucifer and the rebellion in heaven, we've spoken about how that is a story of freedom and equality, and how each of the parties feels that they are going to run society. Lucifer looks at themselves and sees themselves as the most beautiful angel, as the angel that's the head of the choir, the angel that deserves respect, you know. And then Lucifer sees Jesus Christ being honored above them. And so Lucifer, in Lucifer's mind, wants to invert this and create a truly unequal distribution of power. So in each of these circumstances, it's parties feeling that they are entitled to power, and so they want to maintain a certain hierarchy or system that keeps them in power. And so Lucifer fulfills this criteria. Lucifer feels that there's how things are run in heaven isn't okay, and it's not according to what Lucifer feels is truly entitled to them. And so Lucifer wants to create this unequal distribution of power. And how Lucifer goes about doing this is, as we've discussed in previous studies throughout the movement, is by implementing a system where freedom and equality come head to head, but freedom takes its place. That's Lucifer's goals. On the basis of power and how these relate to these lines of discrimination that we've discussed, we can see that there's a very close union. And so, as I said, going to those three histories, as I said earlier on, that we would see how this is demonstrated in each of these histories. We can start off in 1850, 1888, and then today. In 1850, what was the problem? in 1850.
Slavery.
Mhm. Sorry. So the direct answer is slavery, but we recognize that there was much more going on in America than the slavery question. It played it underpinned a lot of the dynamics that were occurring between, if you want to say, the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South. But why was slavery so important in that struggle between the North and the South? The Union, run by the North, didn't want, when the Southern states threatened to secede from the Union, they didn't want these states to secede because it would have threatened, the idea of the United States as a nation. And so secession from these southern states would have allowed individual states to break away, creating new countries that could, form their own alliances with foreign powers and destabilize the political and economic scene of the region in which they were in. And so from that description, you can see that it again had to do with this balance of power. The North was your more industrial region in the Americas, where immigrants coming from Europe were coming and mostly settling in the North, and taking on the jobs in these manufacturing jobs. The South, with the better climate, if you want to call it that, was more agrarian, was more of an agricultural based economy. So through the years, as the years passed on, by about 1860, between the 1800s and 1860, the percentage of laborers working in agriculture in the North dropped from like 70% to 40% and increased in manufacturing. And the institution of slavery virtually died out in the North. Slave labor was replaced in the cities and factories by immigrant labor from Europe. And if I were to think of the proportions of immigrants and where they did settle, about 7 out of every 8 settled in the North rather than the South, because of these better jobs in manufacturing. And so you have this power struggle between the North and the South that is underpinned by slavery. If you take away slavery, that agricultural economy in the South dies. I can't remember. I can't remember who did the study on, at least within in our fellowship, about yeah, it might have been Samoy. Yeah, you're right. About Henry Clay and the Compromise, and if we were to think of the Compromise of 1850, what underpinned that compromise? Sure, there was the element of, returning a slave to their slave, a formerly enslaved person to their slaveholder, but what were the other elements in that package deal of that 1850 compromise? What was it about in that area? What were the tensions in that time period? Samoy can answer, or anyone else can answer. Think of Texas. Think of what's happening with all these new states that are being added.
States want to join the union. I was going to say annexation of Texas. Yeah, they want to join the union, and some states hold slaves and some don't. And they're concerned that if they add states that agree with slavery to the union, that the slave states will outnumber the non-slave states. So again,
why did that matter? Sorry, carry on.
For the same reason I suppose you've been stating about the economy, economically and politically, the power struggle, that the South would have more power to dictate what goes on, where the money goes, how people are treated, the individual rights of people to have slaves.
Sure.
We're not hitting that.
Prior to 1863, Abraham Lincoln, it's been documented that Abraham Lincoln had different views to slavery that he did post 1863. His views around slavery changed. Sure, he was an abolitionist, but what type of abolition? And Emma, you've brought this up. What type of abolitionist was he? What did he want with slavery?
Lincoln, I've forgotten the name. But they wanted to send the black people, the slaves, back to Africa. They didn't want to give them equal rights and status in America. They just wanted to send them back home, what they called home.
So, in that struggle between the North and the South, sure, there was this somewhat element of empathy for the oppressed, but as we can see, that a lot of what underpinned the struggle between the Union and the Confederacy is this vying for power, is this raw politics between the states and how society was going to be run. So sure, there was this element of discrimination. There was this element of wanting to change the way people thought about slavery and enslaved people and race. But part and package of that was just raw, unadulterated politics amongst it all. This is just a minute perspective on the matter. Sure, it's a lot more complicated than that, but this is just the point that I'm bringing about. And so when we go down to 1888, we see similar dynamics playing out with Protestants and religious intolerance. Sunday laws, as I had spoken about in the beginning, you have Sunday laws wanting to be enforced to be able to control society, to be able to maintain the powers that existed with the Protestants. You have more free thinkers, you have more Catholics, a very small portion of that threat, Seventh-day Adventists, making up society. And so their hold on power is now being challenged. Their hierarchy of what religion should look like is now being challenged. Their sense of entitlement to that hierarchy is now being challenged. And so in steps in a group of people, those in power, that put in laws to maintain that hierarchy. So there's three elements that run together. There's the hierarchy that's being challenged. That hierarchy is based on an ascribed status. So if you are born in the 1800s and you are a Protestant in America, you are automatically higher up than your Jewish counterparts in society. You're on a different level in that pecking order. So there's that hierarchy based on that ascribed status. There is the laws that exist to enforce that hierarchy or to maintain that hierarchy of that ascribed status. In the case of 1850, it's Sunday laws. And then finally is it's an ideology that rationalizes the existence of that hierarchy. Ideology that rationalizes why that hierarchy should be maintained. So if we were to rewind for a second and see these three elements in action in the 1850s and through the slavery period, that hierarchy was based on race and ethnic group and etc. A white sure, it was a white man, but we'll say white people are higher up in this hierarchy than black people, or specifically related to slavery. And the laws that exist to maintain that hierarchy are the slavery laws, and the different laws that are passed to make sure that this hierarchy is maintained. And that the ideology that rationalizes the existence of this is that black people and white people are different. They have different brains, they have different qualities. They essentially are different people that have different pros and what makes them better. So one way of thinking of this is the idea that black people coming from Africa are accustomed to working long hours in the sun, and so they would fare better on the cotton fields. So that's the ideology of why we should have this hierarchy, right? As well as black people being inferior to white people. That's the ideology that says, okay, this is why we should have this hierarchy of white people at the top, black people at the bottom. And this is applicable to nationalities and ethnic groups as well. I'm just focusing on race for the purposes of 1850 and slavery. And then the laws is slavery itself, a collar around the necks of your enslaved people to make sure that this hierarchy is maintained and is perpetuated. 1888, it's that ascribed status, something inherent to you, so your religion. And then the ideology is coming out of the Dark Ages. Protestants were oppressed. I'm specifically relaying it to the Catholic Church. Protestants were oppressed. And so we've come here to this new nation, the United States, and we believe that we should be free from persecution from Catholics. And so if Catholics immigrate into America and become the dominant group again, we are going to be oppressed then. So our way of worship is what's best for society, really. Our way of worship is, yeah, sure, it's what's best for society, but there is no room for others, if you want to call it that. And so the way that we're going to enforce that and maintain that is through your Sunday laws. So then finally coming down to today, if I can rub out these three things. You have your patriarchy, which is that hierarchy that we're talking about. Patriarchy is said hierarchy that needs to be maintained. And the ideology, I'm going to say, is sexism. And your laws, or what acts as this police, is misogyny. And so in this book, the author offers a description or a distinction between misogyny and sexism. And there's various different ways in which you can understand these two terms or these two different concepts. But this is just one that this author, her name is Kate Mann. I think that's how you pronounce her surname. This is how she describes it. And so I'm going to paste a snippet from the book into the chat for someone to read very quickly. And that is when speaking about misogyny. So can I ask, Debbie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Please, could you read just that definition or description paragraph I put in the chat?
I argue that misogyny should not be understood as a monolithic, deep-seated psychological hatred of girls and women. Instead, it's best conceptualized as the law enforcement branch of patriarchy, a system that functions to police and enforce gender norms and expectations and involves girls and women facing disproportionately or distinctively hostile treatment because of their gender, among other factors.
She goes on to say in a separate paragraph, in addition to this, misogyny is typically, though not invariably, a response to a violation of gendered law and order, or this ideology. She says, in general, I think of misogyny as being a bit like the shock collar worn by a dog to keep them behind one of those invisible fences that proliferate in suburbia. Misogyny is capable of causing pain, to be sure, and it often does so. But even when it isn't actively hurting anyone, it tends to discourage girls and women from venturing out of bounds. If we stray or err, we know what we are in for. And so misogyny, as she's putting across, is an act, is something that's done to make sure that women don't step out of place. So the different misogynistic acts that we can think of are sexual abuse, sexual harassment, mansplaining, if you've come across that term, and there's many more, dominance, and there's many more that we can list out. But the point is that there's a means of enforcing what this hierarchy should be, the patriarchy. And then in describing sexism, on the other hand, she lays out this definition, which, if I could get another reader.
In contrast to misogyny, I take sexism to be the theoretical and ideological branch of patriarchy, the beliefs, ideas, and assumptions that serve to rationalize and naturalize patriarchal norms and expectations, including a gendered division of labor and men's dominance over women in areas of traditionally male power and authority.
So the ideology is that men and women are different. Men and women have intrinsic traits to them. Women are nurturers. Men are leaders. Men are logical. Women are empathetic. You know, these different ideas that society has grown to believe exist in the differences between men and women, and we've covered this extensively. But in essence, it's that belief that rationalizes the existence of this patriarchy. There's men on top and women at the bottom. And to maintain that patriarchy, you need gendered norms. So misogyny acts as the police force to these gendered norms that are listed out or explained in the ideology that is sexism. So coming back to democracy, to wrap it up. Democracy is a challenge to this idea of ascribed status that we spoke about at the beginning, whether it be on the basis of race, on the basis of age, on the basis of royalty, on the basis of sex. It's a challenge to that, because the rights of all individuals in said society are given, or are, I won't say given, but are allowed to flourish under said democratic principles, where it provides a framework for protecting these individual rights and freedoms, in our case, the rights of women. So laws and policies in your democratic societies are determined through a process of representative government. Thank you, Debbie, for, again, that presentation where you laid out the different governments, where all individuals have an equal voice and have equal representation in that. The reason why is to ensure that the rights and interest groups of all women, regardless of their race, regardless of their age, regardless of their sex, is taken into consideration. So when democracy starts to break down, often, as is being seen in Afghanistan, it's the rights of women and other marginalized groups that are the first to be oppressed. Why is it always, or why is it women that are at the forefront of this? Is because this sin, this problem that undergirds each and every one of these unwarranted hierarchies started there. It started with Eve. It started with said prophecy being foretold of what would befall Eve. And so you have that first fall, and then the prophecy given of what would be her lot, as well as women to follow. And then you have Ham. So in that time period between Eve and Ham, between then and the flood, is yeah, I see a hand. Okay, I don't know, someone was raising their hand. But in that time period, you have it become more ingrained in society's mind that men are at the top of this hierarchy, really. Women messed up, and so men are going to run things in between Eve. And so from having an egalitarian society that God set up, where Eve and Adam are given dominion over the earth, over society, these hierarchies based on ascribed status start to be created, starting with Eve. And then you have Ham, where it becomes easier to do so on the basis of nationality, because this is how we've been running things with women. So as soon as you have an outer group, a different nationality coming into the picture down the road, it just becomes proliferated. And then on the basis of religion, as we've seen. And so, in conclusion, democracy creates a framework for addressing and challenging at its core this belief in ascribed hierarchies. And so once you have democracy falling, that challenge to those ascribed hierarchies falls by the wayside. And so you have nationalism rising, you have patriarchy showing its face more so, you have men in power more so. So as soon as that system of government starts breaking away that exists to challenge said ascribed hierarchies, you have these ascribed hierarchies starting to emerge again. When monarchy fell, society started to become more and more egalitarian in how it viewed race, gender, socio-economic policies, and etc. And then as soon as democracy starts to descend, these forms of discrimination start to rise. And as Natalie pointed out, for some, privileges are invisible to those that have it. So if we were to think of male privilege, I'll relay an anecdote to where that was the case, on the basis of okay, no, I won't, but I'll put it in that way, that males, because of growing up in this framework, in this hierarchy where you as an individual, a man, have been taught to rationalize why this hierarchy should exist, a lot of it becomes blind to you. A lot of it becomes just part of everyday society. It's how things work. It's how things operate. And so for you, your privileges in that hierarchy become second nature, if you want to call it that. They just become a way of life. And so as Natalie points out, it's invisible. And as is the case with a lot of male privilege, I can said male privilege is that I can do something. I'll just so a man walking down the street at night doesn't think for a second, that this is I'm just going home, I'm just taking a walk home. And then the question arises when a woman is scared to walk home, why are you scared? And a man says, there's no need to be scared. It's a safe city. That's just an example, a very minute example of male privilege, is that you as a man have privileges that you're blind to, that women don't face. And it's seen in workplaces, in how we interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. And it's said male privileges that backs this sense of entitlement to authority. So the papacy, why they were afraid of democracy rising is because there were privileges afforded to the Catholic Church that existed under the system of government where kings worked in collaboration with the papacy. And as soon as that privilege is challenged, they become aware that, hold on, actually, I do have this privilege. It's as soon as privileges are attacked that you become aware of them. So as a man, I've lived my whole life with certain privileges. And as soon as it starts being addressed and it being taken away, then I become cognizant of the fact that it exists. And I don't want that taken away. And the Catholic Church didn't want that taken away. And democracy is meant to take away those privileges that one group has that another group does not. It's meant to equal the playing field. So democracy falling means that that playing field doesn't get equaled, doesn't get leveled, if I should call it that. So that's me trying to understand, at least, why there's this close relationship between democracy and each of these three histories, where a sin is being addressed by God in the form of slavery, race, nationalism, religious intolerance, and today sexism. God's trying to fix this intrinsic sin, this problem that perpetuates through each and every one of them. But in doing that, democracy is at the forefront of each of those battles in society. It's being challenged at each and every one of those stages. It's not long after enslaved people are given freedom that, I should say, Black men are given the right to vote. It's not long after just the very nature of a Sand law fights against the democratic principles addressed in the Constitution or a more non-binding document, the Declaration of Independence, that guarantees religious freedom. And then today, democracy challenged in various ways, whether we want to point to the undermining of elections. And it's no coincidence that we have election deniers at a time when women's rights in America are being questioned by the right, and in all the other ways democracy is being challenged. That's a study for another day. But my point is that these run parallel, democracy and gender discrimination in our history, at least, because they all form part of the same sin, the same problem that has started at the very beginning, a sense of entitlement and belief in maintaining an ascribed hierarchy. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, about what I covered. I may have rushed through a few points, apologize, but it's a study in progress. But does anyone have any other questions or contributions before we close?
Could you just put the name of the book that you read on the forum, please?
Sure. It's looks like this. I will post the picture in the group. And yeah.
What did you get from it, Curtis?
I can talk about that at a separate point, but from the book. But for the purposes of now, yeah, keep it at what we discussed today.
Yeah, you mentioned when she said misogyny is an act done to make sure that women don't step out of place. And you said different acts are sexual abuse, dominance, and men's, did you say men's skimming or something? I've never heard that term. I don't know what it is.
Oh, mansplaining, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So mansplaining, does anyone want to give a definition?
Is that, sorry, is that spelled like explaining? I don't even know how to spell it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's mansplaining. So in essence, there's different ways of understanding it, but ultimately it's a man explaining something to a woman in a condescending, patronizing manner. It's at its origin, it's specifically related to, let's just say you're a doctor, Emma, and you study anatomy, and I come to you and we're discussing something, and now I believe that I'm entitled to being right in this conversation because I'm a man. I may not think because I'm a man, but because, you know, of how society has molded me and my thinking. We're talking about a certain concept in medicine, and you say something, Emma, as the doctor, as the professional in that industry who does know better, but I argue with you, Emma, coming from a position of no real authority in medicine, and yet I want to explain to you what this concept is. And most of the time, as a man, I'm wrong in that thing, but I double down on the fact that I'm right on whatever it is. That's typically where it happens, but in other instances, both parties, you know, could be right, but it's typically in a condescending, patronizing manner where a man explains something to women.
So yeah, I suppose that links, I think someone's put it in the chat. It often happens in situations where a woman has expertise or experience, but the man assumes he knows better because of his gender. And I suppose we've talked about that in terms of committee meetings where the male, board meetings where the man's voice is dominant and people have respect to the man's voice more than the woman's, which is very much cultivated in society anyway. Yeah, like a lot of this things, you're raised up to believe that, even the women believe that often.
Yeah, exactly. And it maintains that hierarchy, that patriarchy, that because I'm at the top of this patriarchy, I'm entitled to, in that board meeting, have the voice, have the final say, be the dominant one. You're right.
It's quite interesting, that whole concept of ascribed status, that we think we're entitled, because all of us would think, you know, based on the Constitution, that we're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the, you know, acquisition of property. But we've all got certain basic rights, like you said, to food, to water, to life, that everybody would hold on to and fight for. And if you think that they think that that's my right, then why wouldn't they fight if it's being taken away? Because they actually believe. And I was thinking it's very similar to the way we approach God and the Bible, and the way people opposing this message are approaching it, that I actually think that that's what God wants. I actually think God set up patriarchy, for instance, and that's why I'm going to fight tooth and nail to protect it, because I'm here defending God's honor. And it's the same ethos. We would, that's the religious approach to it, but it's the same ethos that someone in society has. I'm going to fight for my rights as a man, as a father of my children, as a family man. You know, that all those same way that they reason it is the same way we would reason that we want to defend God. And to them, that's their highest principle, in a sense, to defend what they think is their right. And so we put a wall up around that and defend it to the hilt because we think that's what the right thing to do. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, precisely. There's always an ideology, ethos, I like the word you used, that rationalizes why that ascribed status should exist. And I said sexism, you know, but in that we can break it down to your religious beliefs that are sexist in nature. And so you will die on that hill to maintain that hierarchy because you believe that it's right. You rationalize it being right.
And
Thank you. That was...
Yeah, and it's very interesting how when you talk about democracy like that and how we see democracy as working or working to an extent in the world, we think, well, actually, what would a true democracy have looked like? Because you know that even now, say we look at what's happening in this country and we see that money, and nobody is ascribed their status because of their talent, because they're good at the job, or because they're good at the job, or because they're a nice person. I suppose as Christians, what would we say we should ascribe someone's greatness to? Their ability to do the job, or their character, as in they're morally upright? I think we'd say that there has to be both. If we were in a truly Christian democracy, I mean, I don't know if that's what's the word, contradiction in terms, but if you were to look at true democracy, you think, well, how does it work? Because we know it's when you see the Conservative Party, it's all about who you know and how much money you've got, and which school you went to, and so it's class, definitely class and money. So there's rich and poor, and that rich and poor struggle that no rich man is going to want to give up their position to a poor person, because in the back of your head is that idea that if I give someone else more, I'm going to have less. And I think that's the battle that all of us face in different situations, in different scenarios, in different, and so I think we can empathize with the fear that America, that all these countries have, that of giving over power to other people, even if it's power you think are not qualified to have it. People make, they're immoral, they make wrong decisions, they're going to be, prejudiced against someone, or they don't have enough money and education to be able to make that decision. I don't trust this person who's got a third grade education or whatever to do anything, because they don't know what they're talking about. And do I really want to put power into people's hands like that? And that you run that risk when you ask people who are not educated or don't have money or whatever it is, they're not black or white, to make those decisions and to vote in society. So I think each of us, if we're honest, can see that struggle of giving over power to people that you don't trust, because ultimately you'd have to trust people to put them in a position of power over you, and whatever that looks like. And I think that's the battle, and the fact we made about the fact that men are oblivious to that privilege. I think all of us on loads of things are oblivious to our privilege, and I think because it's so connected to suffering. Because if you haven't suffered in a certain way, then you're very oblivious to the fact that people are suffering in that situation. So if you've always had money, you've never had to worry where the food comes from, you were brought up in a house like that, you're never going to worry about, you don't think of it, that's the norm for you. So you don't think about people who are poor and are scraping to make a living and don't know where their next meal's coming from. It doesn't even cross your mind when you're growing up as a child or even as an adult, because that's just the way it is for most people around you. That's the situation. So you're absolutely oblivious to the privilege that you have money, or the privilege of your health if you've never struggled with an illness or a disability, or pain. You know what it's like to struggle with those things. So I think it's a lot of us are oblivious to all the privileges we have, really, when you've got them. And it's only when you don't have them that you recognize how bad it is. And when you suffer yourself, you recognize that actually I was privileged. So, and I think that's why we need so much education on this, because it takes effort to open your eyes and have empathy for people and to change. Yeah.
I think when you're going through the same thing in some, you compare and contrast. When I go to Zimbabwe and I see the comparisons to how we live over here, then you do have lots of empathy.
Yes, and that's the importance of the compare and contrast, isn't it? That's the importance of opening our eyes to see the discrepancy and to see the privilege, so that you can then, as a Christian, or even as a human being, help those around you that don't have the privilege. That's your job function, or one of your job function.
Conservatives often herald, capitalism as the most pure form of meritocracy, where if you work hard, you will you'll rise up in this hierarchy, if you want to call it that. You work hard, you'll merit, you know, the different privileges that you have. But as we see in capitalist society that we live in, that's not the case. And so you have the inability to see whatever privileges that you have in that society. So someone's parents, who very well might have worked hard, you know, you're born into that family. And for someone whose parents, hypothetically speaking, didn't work hard, and that person is born into that family, when you compare those two people at birth, one is at a privileged position and one is at a disadvantaged position through no work or merit of their own, of their birth, if you want to call it that. And so this false idea of capitalism being your pure form of meritocracy and your right way of government is challenged. I appreciate that this study is not about that, but it's just different ways that we see the same problem in each of these problems with society. And it's us taking a step back and recognizing what undergirds the patriarchy. I think that's what my aim was in this, is that there's something to the patriarchy that you see in every facet of life. What is it? What is that sin that undergirds slavery, that undergirds religious intolerance, that undergirds classism, that undergirds all these things that that runs its thread through each of them? I guess I'm still trying to answer that question for myself. This is just one way in which I am thinking of that problem. And often in each of those cases, as we've each pointed out, there is privilege associated to that you get blind to the higher up you go in that hierarchy. So how God's system of government is meant to address that, we'll see. But what I did note when I was thinking about this is that in ancient Israel, at the end of ancient Israel, and I guess you could say at the beginning of ancient Israel, you see each three of these problems existing in the same pot, where the Israelites, so if we were to think of on the basis of nationality, the Israelites, you know, viewed Israel and the Jewish nation as high up, and they have this belief because of centuries of being told that they are, you know, that they are God's chosen people, that they exist to distribute knowledge to the other nations. And then that ends up being turned into this wall of separation that God has to try and break between the Israelites and the Gentiles. And in that same race/nationalism story is the story of religious intolerance. So it's not only is the Jewish nation viewing these other nationalities as impure or of less than, it's their pagan way of life. You pagans, what do you have to offer Israel? What do you Gentiles? You cannot, you don't deserve the blessings that God has to offer. And then the third, patriarchy. Of course, we see it in that story, riddled through the story of ancient Israel, just in how the economy was set up in their monarchy and their priesthood. So there's no running away from that. So I find it interesting that at the alpha of Israel, of ancient Israel, the alpha being Moses, but as ancient Israel as a whole, it's all these three problems encapsulated in their story. And God, in subsequent histories, I don't know if I'm still heard.
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Sure.
Melissa, you might press the mute button or something.
Oh, okay. And then in subsequent histories, God is breaking down those things, which reminds me of the rule of first mention, if you want to think of that, that everything is contained in that origin story. And everything really is contained in that story of Eve, because it's from that everything then is perpetuated. All the problems and on the basis of discrimination start coming to effect. So what is it contained in that prophetic curse at the beginning that gives offspring to these false sense of hierarchies that we see in society? That leads to a monarchy. Israel crying for a king, and finally America standing up and saying, we're going to be a democracy, or God standing up and saying, I'm going to create a democratic country that is going to address each of these problems, that these three problems that society is faced. And when addressing those three problems, ultimately, if we are going to think about the principles that undergird all of them, should address all the others, instead of thinking of them as monolithic problems, monolithic sins, i.e. thinking of slavery as its own thing and thinking of religious intolerance as its own thing and sexism as its own thing. We can see what undergirds each and every one of them. And I think that's the purpose of understanding principles behind what God is trying to teach us. So in understanding the principles of what upholds patriarchy, we as people, as God's people, can begin to address all these other things, classism, etc., etc. Our focus as a people today is the patriarchy, however. But if we can understand what undergirds that, then I think that goes on the path that God is trying to restore us to.
Okay, it's nearly 12 o'clock now. So, oh, sorry.
Can I ask that? Yeah. Can I just finish with that? You know what's? Oh, sorry. Were you going to just say finish it, Debbie?
I'll just remind you it's nearly 12 o'clock.
Okay. It's a quick. Well, it might not be a quick point, but what's on the board at the moment? So, you're talking about the restoration of it. Would you be able to put a word in there for us about what you think it should have looked like, or what it's going to look like in heaven? You know, like we've got ascribed status, hierarchy, we've got ideology and laws. Can we do a one word or not? No.
I cannot. Sorry.
But I was thinking about the ideology that at the root of all of it, selfishness, I suppose, when we see that, if we bring it down to its raw material, about selfishness replacing unconditional love at the beginning of the controversy. But when sin comes in, it's all about me and protecting me and not about, which is what we see with equality and freedom. It's all about me and what I want to do, freedom, as opposed to seeing how I can help other people to rise up, helping them.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the ideology is, obviously it's love. If God is love, it's on one level, unselfish love. But the laws and it might be useful to think about that, scribe status, where we're heading.
If you think of the word democracy, which is split up into two, kratos and demos, well, it means power of the people. So God is changing that self into power of the people, isn't he?
Right, so to empower every individual.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we were to think of, your government at the top, this isn't meant to be a pyramid, forgive me. It's power coming from the bottom as opposed to power ruling from the top. That's not to, make inferences of what the government of heaven is or looks like. But even if we think of that, I recognize that, God is calling us to rule alongside Jesus. So even in that system of government, what does it look like? But that's not what I'm seeking to address. But anyway, it's how God is solving the earth problem. That's what this is. But I'll close it there for now. And I appreciate the various contributions made through, as always. And I pray that some of what I said made sense, at least. It is still, I'll admit, a work in process in my mind. But I appreciate all your contributions nonetheless.
Can we stop the recording, please?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was going to pray.
Yeah, we'll close with a word of prayer. Now, dear God, thank you for this educative journey that you're taking us on. I pray that on it, each and every one of us may be able to recognize the privileges that we have in society. Some privileges are, things that we should be privileged to. And some privileges have come from this false sense of authority, this false ideology that has been perpetuated throughout the years, that has been grown, manifested in different ways in a bid to maintain that power, that authority, with the papacy, with slavery, with the Protestant church, with where we are today in the patriarchy. I pray that as men, and all the men on this call may be able to recognize their privileges, warranted and unwarranted, and become aware of them so that we may be more empathetic to the women in our lives. And I pray that women on the call as well may become aware of the problems that they see themselves in. They say or should I say, it helps to be aware of where you are being discriminated against, because then you can fight against it and contribute to that fight against it. So I thank you for that educator process where you've been with us on this journey as we try to demolish these hierarchies based on ascribed status. I pray that you may help us to understand the root sin in each of these facets of our lives, so that we may better glorify you and serve each other through unconditional love and empathy. Thank you and praise your name. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you.
Curtis.
Can they call me stopped, please? Thank you so much, Curtis. That was really an excellent study. And